In 1944, the war in Europe was reaching its decisive phase. Germany, once confident in its military power, was beginning to feel the crushing weight of Allied production. In Berlin, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, studied reports that chilled even his steel-like resolve. One late evening, a messenger delivered intelligence. America had produced 96,000 aircraft in a single year. Speer dismissed it at first as exaggeration, a bluff designed to frighten the Reich. But then, confirmation came from multiple sources: photographs, shipping manifests, even frontline reports of endless squadrons darkening the skies over Europe. Speer sat in his office, staring at the figures. Germany, with all its forced labor and ruthless efficiency, could barely manage a fraction of that. The Luftwaffe was already crippled, its pilots inexperienced, its fuel supplies dwindling. And yet America was pouring planes into the war like a factory pouring out toys. For the first time, Speer realized what Hitler refused to admit: the war was lost. The German people had been promised invincibility, but against this tidal wave of American industry, combined with Soviet manpower and British resilience, Germany was standing on the edge of ruin. And so, night after night, Speer carried this secret knowledge. In meetings, he watched Hitler rage about miracle weapons and total war. In his heart, he knew the truth. The Reich was doomed the moment U.S. factories hit full stride, the turning point of production. In the dimly lit offices of Berlin, Albert Speer pored over reports that seemed almost unbelievable. The numbers did not lie, yet they defied all sense of scale. America, across the Atlantic, had built 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. To most in the Reich, such figures sounded like exaggerations, Allied propaganda designed to sap German morale. But Speer was no ordinary bureaucrat. He was the man responsible for Germany's armaments, and he understood the language of production better than anyone else in Hitler's circle. For months, Speer had been balancing impossible equations. German factories were under constant Allied bombing raids. Raw materials were running dangerously low, and skilled laborers had been drafted into the military. The numbers he saw on his desk each day told him the same story. Germany could not keep up. And yet here was evidence that America was producing planes not by the hundreds, but by the tens of thousands, an industrial tidal wave rising across the ocean. At first, Speer wanted to dismiss the reports. Surely they must have been exaggerated. Perhaps they included training aircraft, perhaps outdated models that would never reach combat. But as intelligence continued to flow in, photographs of vast assembly lines, reports of convoys bringing more and more machines to Europe, his doubts evaporated. The enemy truly had this power at their fingertips. The very idea of 96,000 planes was staggering. To put it into perspective, Germany's most ambitious production schedules for the Luftwaffe barely scraped a fraction of that figure. And even those numbers were collapsing as fuel shortages and relentless bombing raids crippled the supply chain. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, was now losing aircraft faster than they could be replaced. Speer realized something chilling. This was not merely an arms race. It was a demonstration of industrial dominance on a scale the world had never seen. While Germany relied on meticulous engineering, handcrafted weapons, and the sweat of forced labor, America had perfected the art of mass production. Their factories were not just buildings. They were machines themselves, turning raw steel into flying fortresses at a pace that Germany could never match. For Speer, the turning point was not the clash of armies on the battlefield, but the cold, mechanical certainty of these numbers. It was a war of factories, not just of soldiers, and in that war, Germany was already defeated. No strategy, no battlefield brilliance, no desperate gamble could counteract an enemy capable of producing more planes in a single year than Germany could hope to field in its entire arsenal. The image haunted him. Endless rows of aircraft rolling off assembly lines, wings glistening under factory lights, engines roaring to life before being shipped to distant airfields. Each plane represented not only American engineering, but also a brutal reminder of Germany's limits. Against this flood, every German fighter in the skies was nothing more than a candle in a storm. Inside Hitler's bunker, discussions raged about new miracle weapons, jet fighters, and rockets that could turn the tide of war. But Speer knew the truth that others dared not voice aloud. Even if Germany invented the deadliest aircraft imaginable, it would never matter. They could build a few dozen, perhaps even a few hundred, but what use was that against 96,000 American machines, each backed by a steady flow of replacements? The realization struck him like a weight pressing down on his chest. Germany's war machine was already running on fumes, surviving on borrowed time. Meanwhile, America had barely tapped into its full potential. Speer could see it clearly. While Germany was fighting for survival, the Allies were fighting with abundance. That contrast was not a strategy, it was a sentence. And so, as the Reich's leaders shouted about total war and unshakable faith, Albert Speer stared at those numbers and felt something darker than fear: inevitability. For him, the turning point of the war was not D-Day, not Stalingrad, not even the bombings of German cities. It was the moment he understood that America's factories, those faceless, relentless giants of steel and fire, had already written the ending of the story, the scale of American industry. When Albert Speer looked deeper into the reports, he realized that American production was not just large, it was beyond anything the world had ever witnessed. The United States had transformed its civilian industries into engines of war, converting car plants into tank factories, automobile assembly lines into bomber lines, and shipyards into steel giants that worked around the clock. Imagine a factory in Detroit where automobiles once rolled out daily. By 1944, that same facility was producing B-24 bombers, massive machines of war, at a pace so fast that entire fleets could be assembled in weeks. These weren't isolated factories scattered across the nation. They were part of a coordinated industrial machine that spanned coast to coast. Day and night, without pause, American workers, men, women, and even teenagers, stood shoulder to shoulder, riveting metal, installing engines, and testing weapons. Entire cities had become workshops of war. The sheer rhythm of the production line, the constant hum of machinery, created an unstoppable heartbeat that pulsed through the American war effort. For Speer, the shock came not only from the number of planes, but from the efficiency behind them. Germany had always prided itself on precision, on craftsmanship, on engineering marvels like the Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf. But America's genius was different. It lay in repetition, standardization, and the ability to replicate a design thousands of times without delay. The reports detailed assembly lines so vast that planes moved forward inch by inch, each worker performing a single task until, at the final stage, a complete aircraft rolled out ready for war. These were not workshops, they were conveyor belts of destruction. And in that realization, Speer saw the terrifying contrast. Where Germany built with sweat and scarcity, America built with speed and abundance. What haunted him most was the resilience of this system. While German factories crumbled under Allied bombing raids, American industry was shielded by oceans, untouchable by enemy aircraft. Every time Germany lost a factory, its production shrank. Every time America lost a ship at sea, 3 more were ready to take its place. The imbalance grew wider with every passing month. The numbers alone told a grim story. At the height of 1944, America was producing nearly 8,000 aircraft per month, more than Germany could hope to build in an entire year under constant fire. To Speer, this wasn't just production, it was momentum, a relentless wave that no strategy could stop once it was in motion. American factories did not only produce planes, they produced hope for the Allies and despair for Germany. Every bomber that flew over German skies carried with it the symbol of this unstoppable industrial force. For every German plane shot down, 2 or 3 American replacements were already in the air, heading into combat. In his private thoughts, Speer marveled at the psychology of it. To the German leadership, industry was a tool. But to America, industry was a weapon in itself, just as devastating as any tank or bomb. The sight of endless squadrons over Europe was not merely military might. It was the visible shadow of American factories, factories that never slept, factories that never stopped. The scale of American industry was, to Speer, a revelation that carried the weight of finality. He knew then that the war had shifted from a battle of armies to a battle of machines. And in that battle, Germany was fighting a giant whose fists were forged of steel, whose heartbeat was the pounding of hammers, and whose weapon was time itself that Germany struggled to keep pace. As Albert Speer studied the reports of American production, the comparison with Germany's own factories cut like a knife. Where the United States enjoyed overflowing resources and secure factories, Germany's industrial base was under siege. Allied bombers struck relentlessly, reducing vital plants to rubble, halting production for weeks, sometimes months. Each time Speer managed to restart a facility, another raid would undo his efforts. Germany's problem was not only destruction, but scarcity. The Reich was running out of steel, aluminum, and fuel. Mines were overstretched, supply chains disrupted, and the transportation network shattered by bombing raids on railways and bridges. Even when factories could function, raw materials rarely arrived in time. Every finished aircraft came at the expense of something else: tanks, artillery, or even the ammunition soldiers desperately needed at the front. Speer knew that Germany's so-called total war economy was riddled with contradictions. While American civilians sacrificed luxuries to support the war effort, German leaders still clung to illusions of normal life for the people. Cinemas stayed open, consumer goods were still produced, and valuable labor hours were wasted on non-essential items. The Reich never truly committed its entire economy until it was already too late. Another wound to production was manpower. Many of Germany's best engineers, machinists, and skilled laborers were pulled into the military to fight at the front. In their place, Speer was forced to rely on prisoners of war, forced laborers, and concentration camp inmates. They toiled under brutal conditions, often sabotaging their work, producing machines that broke down more easily, and costing Germany precious time and repairs. The Luftwaffe's decline was visible in every report Speer received. New planes were leaving the factories, but not in the numbers needed to replace battlefield losses. Young, inexperienced pilots were trained too quickly, thrown into combat with little chance of survival. Planes that took months to design and weeks to build were destroyed in minutes by swarms of Allied fighters. It was a cycle of loss that no amount of German engineering could break. Speer often contrasted the image of a German factory under blackout conditions. Workers shivering from lack of heating, machines falling silent during bombing raids, with the descriptions of American assembly lines. Brightly lit, fully supplied, operating 24 hours a day. The difference was not just material, it was psychological. One side worked with abundance and optimism, the other with fear and exhaustion. Each time Hitler demanded miracle weapons, Speer tried to explain the hard truth. Even miracles required resources, fuel, and manpower. A jet fighter or a rocket could inspire terror, yes, but building them in meaningful numbers was impossible. The Reich was bleeding from too many wounds, and every new demand stretched the already fragile production network closer to collapse. The disparity grew more painful when Speer compared the raw numbers. Germany struggled to produce a few thousand aircraft in a year, while America produced tens of thousands in the same time. Every effort to close the gap failed. Bomb damage, resource shortages, and constant pressure from the front lines made sure of that. For every German plane that rose into the air, there were 5 Allied planes waiting to meet it. What haunted Speer most was the waste of talent and ingenuity. German engineers were some of the finest in the world, creating designs that pushed the limits of technology. Yet these innovations were smothered by the crushing reality of limited output. America's planes might not always be superior individually, but there were always more of them, enough to overwhelm even the most advanced German machine. In his private reflections, Speer admitted to himself that Germany was not simply losing the war. It was being outproduced into irrelevance. While he fought to patch holes in a sinking ship, America built an entire fleet across the ocean. Each passing day widened the gap, and each failed attempt to keep pace confirmed what Speer dared not say aloud. Germany's factories were fighting a battle they could never win, a Speer's silent realization. Albert Speer carried a secret that he could not share openly, not even with those closest to him in the Nazi hierarchy. The more he studied the numbers, the more certain he became that Germany's defeat was not just possible, it was inevitable. Yet in the fevered atmosphere of Hitler's Reich, voicing such a thought was unthinkable. To admit doubt was to invite suspicion, and suspicion often ended with a bullet or a noose. Every morning, Speer presented reports to Hitler. He carefully chose his words, never daring to reveal the full weight of what he knew. Hitler demanded optimism, demanded proof that Germany's sacrifices were bearing fruit. But behind the neat tables and graphs, Speer hid a truth darker than any battlefield loss. The Reich was collapsing under the pressure of Allied industry. What made the realization so tormenting was its finality. Battles could be turned, campaigns could be won, but numbers did not lie. Even if Germany held its ground for a season, the flood of Allied planes and tanks would eventually drown them. No amount of courage from soldiers or brilliance from generals could reverse that tide. Speer began to notice the psychological effect of this truth on himself. While Hitler raged and Goebbels spread propaganda about total victory, Speer sat quietly, watching. The Reich slide toward ruin. He knew that every speech about miracle weapons was nothing more than an illusion, a desperate attempt to mask the fact that production figures had already sealed Germany's fate. In his private moments, Speer wrestled with his conscience. Should he tell Hitler outright that the war was unwinnable? Should he warn the German people that they were being led into catastrophe? Or should he keep silent, maintaining the illusion until the end? Each choice carried danger, not only for himself, but for anyone connected to him. Silence was the safest path, and so silence became his prison. The reports that crossed his desk grew worse with each month. Fuel shortages meant even completed aircraft could not fly. Ammunition supplies dwindled. Trains carrying vital materials never arrived, destroyed by Allied bombing runs. Every page, every figure, was a reminder of Germany's slow strangulation. And each time, Speer folded the documents neatly and pretended the situation was under control. In cabinet meetings, when other ministers shouted about mobilizing more workers or pushing factories harder, Speer remained calm, almost detached. He had already calculated the end. He knew the Reich could not win a war against America's factories, and yet he watched as his colleagues clung to fantasies, blind to the storm gathering around them. Speer's silence was not born of cowardice, but of inevitability. He understood that Hitler would never accept the truth. The Führer demanded loyalty, not logic. To speak of defeat was to invite destruction, and Speer was too valuable to risk losing, at least as long as he maintained the illusion of hope. But inside, Speer felt the weight of his realization growing heavier. He was the architect of Germany's war machine, yet he was also its undertaker, watching as each figure on his charts became a nail in the Reich's coffin. It was a bitter irony. The man responsible for sustaining the war effort was the one who knew, more clearly than anyone else, that the war could not be sustained. And so Speer lived in two worlds. In public, he was the efficient minister, the loyal servant of the Reich. In private, he was the silent witness to its doom, a man who saw the truth in cold, unrelenting numbers. With every passing day, his realization deepened, not with drama, not with sudden revelations, but with the quiet certainty of mathematics that even Hitler's fury could not erase. The sky darkened by planes. Albert Speer's most haunting confirmation of Germany's impending defeat did not come from reports on paper alone. It came from the battlefield, from the front lines, from the testimonies of soldiers and the living nightmare in the skies above Europe. Again and again, dispatches arrived from weary German officers describing scenes that seemed less like warfare and more like the hand of an overwhelming force descending upon them. Entire skies, they wrote, were filled with American bombers, vast formations stretching from horizon to horizon, their engines thundering like an oncoming storm. These were not occasional raids, but daily occurrences, relentless as the rising of the sun. Even the bravest German pilot could not look upward without feeling dread, for above them was not a mere squadron. It was an industrial ocean of aircraft that poured across the heavens, blotting out the light. Speer read these accounts in silence, and the image stayed with him. Black shadows gliding across the land, each one a symbol of America's factories working at full capacity. For every German plane that fought its way into the air, there were dozens of Allied fighters ready to pounce, circling like predators around a wounded animal. The scale of these aerial fleets was something Germany had never been prepared to face. In the early years of the war, the Luftwaffe had ruled the skies with daring and innovation. But by 1944, those days were gone. Germany no longer controlled the air, it merely endured it. Pilots who returned from missions spoke with disbelief at what they had seen. Hundreds upon hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators, escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustangs, each formation moving with clockwork precision. They were not merely aircraft, they were a demonstration of American production power, airborne monuments to factories that could replace every lost machine 10 times over. Speer understood immediately what these scenes meant. Once the sky belonged to the enemy, the land below could never be held. No city, no factory, no railway line was safe. Germany was living under a ceiling of steel. The psychological impact of these endless squadrons was devastating. Soldiers at the front felt abandoned beneath the shadow of Allied aircraft. Their every movement watched, their every supply line hunted from above. Civilians, too, came to dread the sound of distant engines, knowing it was only a matter of time before the bombs fell again. Even before the destruction began, the sight of those fleets inspired despair, an acknowledgement that Germany's enemies were not fighting with limited strength, but with bottomless reserves. Speer, though insulated in his offices, felt the same dread as he reviewed the reports. Each new figure he added to his calculations was confirmed by what German eyes were already seeing above their heads. Skies crowded with American machines, skies that never emptied. There was one report Speer never forgot. A German officer described watching the daylight sky over France vanish beneath layer upon layer of bombers, like waves upon waves rolling across the sea. "We fired until the barrels melted," the officer wrote, "but it was like throwing stones at the ocean. They kept coming. Always more. Always another wave." That line haunted Speer because it perfectly captured the reality of Germany's struggle, not simply against an enemy, but against infinity itself. How could one nation hope to resist a machine that seemed to have no end, no limit, no exhaustion? The mathematics of the battlefield had turned into mathematics of despair. Speer also knew that these endless fleets were not random. They were part of a systematic strategy designed to suffocate Germany from the inside out. First the factories, then the railways, then the oil refineries, then the very cities themselves. Each target chosen with precision, each raid calculated to squeeze the lifeblood out of the Reich. And America, with its seemingly inexhaustible supply of aircraft, could repeat these raids indefinitely. Germany could shoot down dozens, even hundreds, but it never mattered. The next day the skies would be filled again, as if nothing had been lost. For every German pilot who risked his life, there were 10 Allied pilots waiting with brand new machines at their disposal. In cabinet meetings, Hitler raged at these reports, insisting that new jet fighters would turn the tide, that miracle weapons would scatter the enemy formations. But Speer sat quietly, knowing that such dreams were futile. 100 jets could not face 10,000 bombers. Even if the Mi-262s roared into the sky with unprecedented speed, their fuel shortages, lack of trained pilots, and constant mechanical failures doomed them to be little more than brief sparks in a storm. The truth, unspoken but undeniable, was that Germany's skies were no longer its own. They belonged to the Allies, and the Allies had remade the heavens into an extension of their factories. The reports from German cities deepened Speer's grim certainty. Cologne, Hamburg, Berlin, Dresden, each name became synonymous with fire. The bombs did not merely fall on buildings. They fell on the very spirit of the German people. Civilians huddled in shelters as wave after wave passed overhead, the ground trembling as if the earth itself recoiled from the destruction. Speer walked through the ruins on inspection tours, seeing firsthand the blackened shells of factories, the twisted steel of machinery, the faces of workers hollowed by exhaustion and fear. Each time, he asked himself the same question: how could these broken remnants of industry ever compete with the untouched, unstoppable assembly lines of Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles? Even the Luftwaffe, once Hitler's pride, was reduced to a symbol of futility. Young boys barely out of training were thrown into cockpits, sent up against veterans of the Allied air forces, only to be cut down in minutes. The skies that had once echoed with German dominance now roared with American and British engines, drowning out all hope of reversal. Speer knew that Germany was sacrificing its youth not for victory, but for delay, small fragments of time bought with the blood of pilots who never had a chance. What struck Speer most profoundly was how swiftly the balance of the war had shifted. In just a few years, Germany had gone from the hunter to the hunted, from the terror of Europe to the prey of a machine greater than it could ever build. In the center of that shift was not strategy or tactics, but production, the sheer, overwhelming capacity of America to fill the skies with machines faster than they could be destroyed. The reports of skies darkened by planes were not exaggerations. They were the blunt truth of industrial warfare. And so, Speer kept these reports in his files, each one another piece of evidence that the end was closing in. He did not need to wait for battles to be fought to know the outcome. The outcome was already visible every time a German soldier looked upward and saw the horizon swallowed by wings. The factories of America had remade the war into something more than combat. They had turned it into inevitability, a force of nature disguised as squadrons of steel. And for Speer, each new wave of aircraft blotting out the sun was a reminder that Germany's struggle was not against soldiers, nor even against nations, but against the relentless machinery of time and industry that could not be stopped.